If you're familiar with my other controller reviews, you'll know that I have some pretty strong opinions on this topic. I think a good controller should be intuitive, comfortable, and perform well for all types of games. New controllers for retro systems have an even harder job. Not only do they need to do all of that, they also need to feel familiar enough so that longtime players of the system don't feel like they have to relearn how to play their favourite games. This brings us to the StrikerDC Wireless from Retro Fighters, a wireless controller for the Dreamcast that throws out the original form factor for a modern design. Like with most of Retro Fighters' products, the StrikerDC Wireless is a reimagining of the Dreamcast controller. This isn't trying to replicate the experience of an original pad. The philosophy here is to take the best elements and remix them with modern conventions. I've taken my sweet-ass time to review this controller. I was actually sent several of them to review at the start of the year, but the Dreamcast I had was faulty. I also purchased a fancy new SCART cable for it, which took ages to arrive and then also turned out to be faulty. Long and pointless story short, I've replaced my faulty equipment and have now spent some time with the StrikerDC Wireless. So let me tell you what I think about it. Now, unlike a lot of Retro Fighters' other controllers, the StrikerDC Wireless isn't compatible with anything except the Dreamcast. It does use a USB-C cable for charging and for firmware updates, but it doesn't connect to the PC or anything else. It uses a low latency 2.4 GHz signal which is transmitted via a dongle, and this gives you about 30 feet or 9 meters of range. It has rumble as well as a turbo feature, and the quoted 10 hours of battery life seems pretty accurate. Obviously, this may be slightly less if you play a lot of games that utilize the rumble. Like I said, charging is handled by a USB-C cable, and yes, you can charge and use it at the same time. Okay, so here's the part where I throw in my unpopular opinion. I'm not a huge fan of the Dreamcast controller, although I'm guessing this won't be as unpopular as my thoughts on the GameCube controller. The DC controller definitely isn't the worst, and it was hugely innovative, but it's also big, the stick isn't fantastic, and the position of the cord makes absolutely no sense. So, does the StrikerDC Wireless remedy these issues? Yes, sort of. The big bulky form factor is gone, and in its place is a modern design. I'm all for preserving the original feel of a controller, but I think the StrikerDC's approach is a win. It's comfortable, and it allows you to easily reach all of the buttons, the stick, and the D-pad. The biggest change, which you've probably already noticed, is that the VMU is no longer connected to the controller itself. It's part of the dongle, and this does present some usability issues. Now, Retro Fighters didn't move the position of the VMU because they hate you or they've got no idea. Transmitting data from the VMU wirelessly presents some obvious technical hurdles, requiring it to be wired to the console. For 95% of games this isn't a problem, although there are a handful of titles which utilize the VMU in-game. The NFL games, for example, use it for secret plays, and Dino Crisis uses it for your health and ammo counters. Having the VMU connected to the console via a short lead means that for a few games you'll need to either sit next to the console, not exactly practical, or use an extension lead. Now, I haven't tested the dongle with an extension cable, so I can't confirm that this works, but it could be a potential workaround. The dongle itself feels solid and the cable is nice and thick, and it could easily pass for a genuine product. I like how the colour matches the controller too. This doesn't just look good, it helps you tell controllers apart when you have more than one of these. It's not the most practical design, at least for my setup, but it does allow you to have multiple dongles connected at the same time. One thing that holds true for all of Retro Fighters controllers is that they're well built, and the StrikerDC Wireless continues this tradition. It feels both solid and premium. Now, the original controller's stick and D-pad placement is a little awkward, and for me, I can't reach both simultaneously. I have to constantly change my grip. The StrikerDC Wireless fixes this by allowing you to easily swap between the two. The D-pad on the original controller, aside from being too close to the edge and quite small, is still half decent. The height and travel distance makes performing diagonal and half-circle motions easy enough, and it has this unique elasticy feeling, which I know isn't a word, but it's the best way to describe it. The Striker's D-pad is a different story. It's much bigger and it's positioned lower. Thankfully, it doesn't disappear into the controller like the Defender's D-pad does, so you always know what direction you're pressing. It's slightly more clicky than the original, and I haven't had any problems with the various fighters I've tried it with, although this is far from my favourite D-pad design. I think this is an area that Retro Fighters need to consider redesigning with future controllers. You can definitely use this for fighting games or games that require diagonal inputs, and I do think it's better than the original D-pad. I just like it to feel a smidge more precise. Moving on to the analog stick. This uses a Hall effect stick, and I think this is a big improvement over the original. It registers maximum input just before hitting the gate, which is similar to an original pad. It has a slight dead zone at the start of the movement too. It feels nice and smooth to operate, and if you like Hall effect sticks, you'll feel right at home with this. It should also last longer, although having said that, both my original pads are still going strong. Now the front-facing buttons have more travel distance and are significantly more clicky. This is kind of an unfair comparison though, because my original pads are well over 20 years old. One thing the original pad does better is the spacing between these buttons. Retro Fighters love packing the front-facing buttons tightly together, which is a design choice I don't really understand. It just makes hitting the wrong button easier. That said, this hasn't been a problem for me in practice, although if you have large hands, good luck. Now, with the shoulder L and R buttons, you actually get two sets. On the top row, you get a standard set of buttons that register 100% input on a press. I would have liked them to have a more pronounced clickiness like the front-facing buttons, but this is just my preference and again, doesn't cause any issues during use. On the bottom row, you get two modern-style analog triggers. These are more in line with what you'll find on an OEM pad, giving you control over the amount of input. So for example, they're useful for racing games that use them for the throttle and brake. They have an obvious dead zone at the beginning of the press, which I personally would like to see reduced just a fraction to be more in line with an original pad. It takes a little too long to register input for my liking, so hopefully this is something that can be fine-tuned with an update. Compared to an original controller, they have nowhere near the same resistance, and I would have preferred that they had more bite to give you a bit more control. So it will take some getting used to if you're coming from an original pad, and if you're looking for something that feels authentic, you'll need to bear this in mind. Still, despite these minor issues, they function exactly like you'd expect. The StrikerDC Wireless also has decent rumble. I admittedly have never tried an original rumble pack, but the rumble here is pretty strong. Also, while official rumble packs seem to be strangely easy to come by, the StrikerDC Wireless is only marginally more expensive. The other advantage is the weight. The controller weighs roughly the same as an original pad, at 215 grams, but if you were to add a rumble pack to the original, then the StrikerDC ends up being much lighter. Okay, what about latency? This has never been an issue with any of the games that I've tested it with. As I said earlier, I played a lot of fighting games because I think it's a genre that separates good controllers from great ones. Fighting games often require precise individual frame inputs and a flawless connection, and you can tell instantly when a pad doesn't stand up to the task. Also, I just really like fighting games, and it's the main reason I own a Dreamcast. Like with all 2.4G connections, there is a small amount of input delay, so a wired controller will still be better for hardcore players, but for everyone else, it's unlikely to be a problem. Beyond this, for other games that demand quick and precise inputs, it holds up well. The StrikerDC Wireless isn't the perfect Dreamcast controller, but it is a very solid option if you want something without a cable. Sure, it's not very authentic, although I'd argue that this is a good thing, and it manages to preserve enough of the original design to not feel completely alien. It doesn't have the best D-pad, and the buttons are a little underwhelming, but as far as being a controller that you can use for everything, I think it does a good enough job. It works well for just about every type of game I've thrown at it, it has some great features, and it retains Retro Fighters' excellent build quality. There are better controllers out there for specific use cases, but as an all-purpose solution, I think this stands up to the task well, and it should definitely be on your shopping list if you're on the hunt for a wireless controller for your Dreamcast.